The Haunting of Ashford Manor. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. The old Ashford Manor stood at the edge of the village, shrouded in fog and decay. The mansion had been abandoned for years, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and the windows dark and empty. Local legends whispered that the house was haunted, cursed, even. But none of that mattered to Rachel. She wasn't a believer in ghost stories, not anymore. She was a skeptic, a journalist, and she had come to Ashford Manor with one goal: to prove that the stories were just that, stories. She arrived late in the afternoon, the sun setting behind the manor, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. Her car tires crunched over the gravel driveway as she parked. The house loomed before her like a sleeping giant, waiting to awaken. Her camera, notebook, and flashlight were packed securely, ready for the investigation ahead. Rachel had heard the rumors. People claimed they saw strange lights flickering in the windows at night. Others spoke of hearing voices, whispers coming from within. But no one who had ventured inside had ever returned the same. She didn't believe in any of it. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and approached the front door. It was ajar, as if someone or something was waiting for her. The chill in the air sent a shiver down her spine, but she shook it off. She had a job to do. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. The staleness of disuse, mixed with the sharp scent of mildew and decay. The entrance hall was large, its ornate wallpaper peeling, the marble floor cracked in places. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes following her every move, the faces of long-dead ancestors staring into her soul. The house was silent, too silent. No creaks or groans from the wooden beams. No wind rattling the windows. Just an eerie, suffocating stillness. Rachel pulled out her camera and began to take photos, documenting the mansion's decay. Her flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath. The beam steadied, and she moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The first thing she noticed was a stairway leading up to the second floor. It was grand, made of polished wood with intricate carvings in the banister. But the stairs weren't what drew her attention. It was the door at the top. It was half open, a sliver of dark space beyond. Something tugged at her curiosity, though she told herself it was just the feeling of being alone in an abandoned place. She walked up the stairs, slowly, her breath shallow, the air thickening with every step. As she reached the top, she paused. The house seemed to exhale, and the air grew colder, pressing against her skin. The door creaked open. The room beyond was shrouded in shadow, but a single beam of light from the window illuminated a large, antique mirror on the far wall. Rachel stepped inside, drawn to it. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. She blinked and looked again. The reflection was distorted, the edges of her face blurred, as though the mirror was warping reality itself. Thump. The sound came from somewhere deep within the house. A heavy thud, like something or someone was moving around. Rachel's heart raced. She wasn't alone. She turned quickly, but there was nothing. The air felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to grow darker around her. The door behind her slammed shut, making her jump. Hello, her voice was thin, weak in the vast emptiness of the house. Nothing. Only silence. Then the voice came. A whisper at first, so faint that Rachel thought she imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time. Get out. Rachel's blood ran cold. She turned toward the mirror, but the reflection wasn't hers anymore. The face staring back at her was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes. It smiled, and the smile was wrong. The mouth stretched too wide, the teeth too sharp. Rachel backed away slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. The door rattled behind her. She turned and ran, her footsteps clumsy as she rushed back to the stairs. But as she reached the landing, the house seemed to shift. The walls trembled, the floors groaned, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening crash. The voice came again, louder this time. Leave, or stay forever. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She ran down the hallway toward the nearest exit, her camera swinging wildly at her side. She wasn't thinking about the photos anymore. She just needed to get out. As she reached the front door, she pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. She yanked harder, panic rising within her, and then she heard footsteps from behind her. Slow. Heavy. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the dark hallway stretching out before her. Yet the air was thick with something, a presence, a weight that she couldn't see but could feel. The shadows seemed to press closer. Then, the whisper came again, right behind her ear. Stay with me. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, but there was still nothing. The house seemed to be alive, its very walls pulsing with an unseen force. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her body screamed to leave, but her legs wouldn't move. You'll never leave, the voice said, now a deep, guttural growl. Rachel turned to run, but as she did, the floorboards cracked beneath her feet, splitting apart like they were alive. She screamed, stumbling backward, and then the mirror. She looked up. It was there, standing at the end of the hall. The reflection was distorted, just as it had been before, but this time, it wasn't just her reflection. There were other faces in the mirror. Twisted faces. Glaring, screaming faces, all reaching toward her with twisted hands. Suddenly, the room went completely dark. She couldn't see her hand in front of her face. The air was thick, suffocating. The only sound was her ragged breathing. Then, in the pitch-black darkness, the whispers came again. You are ours now. The cold fingers brushed across her skin. She gasped, her breath coming out in terrified bursts, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place as if some unseen force was holding her still. In the darkness, a shape emerged. Tall, impossibly tall, with elongated arms and a face that twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was smiling at her, its grin far too wide, its eyes dark voids. Then, as if it were a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, Rachel's vision blurred, and the darkness consumed her. Rachel's vision returned in disorienting waves, her head throbbing as though her mind were being torn from her very body. The last thing she remembered was the suffocating blackness, the cold fingers brushing her skin, and the grotesque, towering figure grinning down at her. But now, she found herself in a different place, though the sensation of something pressing down on her chest never relented. Her eyes fluttered open. She was no longer standing in the dark hallway, but lying on the cold, cracked floor of a room she did not recognize. The space was narrow, claustrophobic walls lined with old, decaying bookshelves that seemed to be closing in around her. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, like a forgotten grave. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the floor, but her fingers brushed against something soft, damp. Her breath quickened as she sat up, eyes frantically scanning the room. The dim light filtering in through a small, barred window cast long shadows, and for a moment, she thought she saw something shift within the darkness, a silhouette, just beyond her reach. "Hello." Her voice cracked, weak and terrified. The silence was almost too much to bear, but it was broken by a low, guttural sound, a scraping noise, like nails dragging across stone. Rachel's heart leapt in her chest, her body frozen in place. She knew, instinctively, that she was not alone. The sound came again. Closer this time. Her breath came faster, shallow. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking an escape, but the only exit was the narrow, iron-barred window, and she couldn't reach it. The scraping sound stopped, and in the unnerving silence that followed, a voice filled the room, soft, yet filled with an oppressive weight. "We are waiting for you." Rachel froze. She knew the voice. It was the same whisper she had heard earlier, the one that had come from the dark recesses of Ashford Manor. But now, it was clearer. More real. Something moved in the shadows, and she forced herself to stand, her legs shaky beneath her. She looked desperately at the walls, searching for a way out, but the room seemed to shrink around her, as though the very house itself were constricting, tightening its grip. Suddenly, the darkness at the far corner of the room seemed to pulse. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, and vaguely human, but its movements were erratic, as though it was not entirely solid. Its face was obscured, hidden in the shadow of its hood, but the cold, hollow eyes that glinted from beneath its cowl were unmistakable. Rachel backed away, her heart hammering in her chest, but her movements were slow, as though the air had thickened, weighing her down. The figure didn't move toward her. Instead, it stood there, watching, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to make the next move. Its eyes burned with a strange intensity, and Rachel felt herself drawn to them against her will. She opened her mouth to scream, but the words got caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think clearly. The weight of the figure's gaze was suffocating, and for the briefest of moments, Rachel thought she might collapse from the sheer terror flooding her veins. Then, the figure spoke again, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo through her very soul. "You belong here now. You are one of us." A sharp, piercing sound cut through the air, a horrible, shrieking noise that rattled her bones and seemed to come from all around her. It was a scream, but not a human one. It was something older, something far more monstrous, like 1,000 tortured souls crying out in unison. Rachel fell to her knees, clutching her ears as the scream echoed louder, drowning out everything else. She wanted to escape, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thickening, suffocating her. Her vision blurred, and the shadows around her grew long, reaching out with tendrils like claws, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down into the floor. And then, just as she thought she might be consumed by the darkness, the screaming stopped. The room was silent once more, but it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of something watching her, something hungry. Rachel's heart raced as she stood shakily. The figure was gone, but the air in the room still felt heavy. A coldness seeped into her bones, and as she looked around, she saw something in the corner of her eye. A shape, one that wasn't there before. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. It was a door. A wooden door, hidden in the shadows, one that had not been there moments before. It beckoned to her. Without thinking, Rachel rushed toward it, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. She tugged on it, but it didn't budge. The door was locked. "Leave," the whisper came again, cold and threatening. "You have nowhere to go." The cold presence seemed to press in on her from all sides, suffocating her, and Rachel knew somehow it was the house itself. The house was alive, its hunger vast, eternal, and unquenchable. But she had no choice. She had to try. Her mind raced for a plan, any way to escape. Her camera, she fumbled around her pockets, pulling out the old cameras she had been using to document her investigation. She could feel the weight of it in her hands like a lifeline, and for a brief, irrational moment, she wondered if she could somehow use it to capture the evil in the house, to expose it. Rachel raised the camera to her eye and snapped a photo. A flash of light erupted in the room, illuminating the walls, the floor, the door, the darkness that surrounded her. When the light faded, she lowered the camera. The door was gone. She turned, frantic now, looking around the room, but there was nothing. The walls, the shelves, the shadows, they had swallowed the door whole. "No." The voice returned, this time from every corner of the room, echoing in her head like a million whispers. "You can never leave. You will join us, forever." Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. Ashford Manor wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, an entity that fed on souls, trapping them within its walls, twisting them into something else. And now, she was part of it. The house had claimed her. As her knees buckled beneath her, and her vision started to fade once more, she heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and steady. "You will never escape us." Her body stiffened in terror as the floor beneath her cracked open, and shadows poured from the cracks like ink, crawling toward her. And then, all was silent.